The night I saved his son was the night I stopped belonging to myself. The smell of burnt coffee clung to the air as I wiped down table 14 for the third time. Even though it was already clean, my feet aching inside cheap black flats after a 10-hour shift that refused to end, the neon beer sign flickering above the bar casting uneven light across the emptying restaurant, while rain tapped softly against the windows like it had nowhere else to go, and neither did I. Lily Carter, 26. Working double shifts just to keep my tiny apartment with the broken heater and the neighbor who played country music at 2 a.m., telling myself this was temporary even though it never felt that way. The kind of night where exhaustion sits heavy behind your eyes and every movement feels half a second too slow, until the door burst open and the cold air rushed in with it, sharp and sudden, carrying a man's voice edged with panic and a child in his arms who wasn't breathing right. And everything inside me snapped into focus, the noise of the room dropping away as chairs scraped and someone gasped and another voice said call 911 but didn't move. And I was already stepping forward before I could think better of it, because some instincts don't wait for permission, because I had taken that first aid class 2 years ago and never expected it to matter, because the boy's face was too still and his small chest wasn't rising the way it should, and I heard myself say lay him down. Now, my voice steadier than I felt as the man hesitated for half a second before obeying, placing the child carefully on the polished wood floor while the overhead lights hummed quietly above us, and I knelt beside him, my knees pressing into the hard surface as I checked his airway, my hands trembling just enough that I had to force them still. Breathe, just breathe, I told myself, tilting his head gently, counting seconds that stretched too long, feeling the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on me, the silence thick and expectant, and then I moved, doing exactly what I had been taught. Nothing more, nothing less, because panic would only make it worse, because there was no room for fear here, not now, not with a life balanced on the edge of a moment. And somewhere behind me someone whispered, "Oh my God," while the rain kept falling against the glass like it didn't care what happened inside. And then suddenly there it was, the smallest shift, the faintest breath, the boy's chest rising just enough to make my own lungs finally remember how to work. Relief hitting me so fast it almost made me dizzy as a soft sound escaped him, fragile but real, and the tension in the room cracked all at once as voices rushed back in, and someone let out a shaky laugh, and I sat back on my heels, my hands still hovering like I wasn't sure it was over yet, like it couldn't be that simple, like something this big should leave more behind than just a quiet breath and a second chance. And that's when I felt it, before I saw him, the shift in the air, the way conversations died mid-sentence and people instinctively stepped aside without being told. The kind of silence that doesn't come from fear alone, but from recognition. And I looked up slowly, my heart still racing from what I'd just done, and saw him standing there across the room. Tall, still, dressed in a dark coat that seemed untouched by the rain. His eyes locked on the boy first, and then on me, sharp and unreadable, like he was measuring something I couldn't see. And no one had to say a word for me to understand that this man wasn't just the child's father, he was something else entirely, something heavier, something that carried weight into a room and bent it without effort. And when he finally took a step forward, the sound of his shoes against the floor echoing softly in the silence, I realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that saving that child hadn't ended anything. It had started something I didn't yet understand. Something that was already reaching for me whether I wanted it to or not. I should have looked away, should have stood up and returned to wiping tables like none of it mattered, like he was just another man in an expensive coat. But I did not, because his eyes held mine with a kind of quiet authority that made it feel like moving without permission would be a mistake, and for a second that stretched too long. The entire room seemed to orbit around that single line of sight. The boy breathing softly on the floor between us while the man stepped closer, each movement precise and unhurried, like time adjusted itself to match his pace. And when he finally knelt beside his son, the sharp edge in his expression softened just enough to reveal something human beneath it, something protective, something that did not belong to the version of him that had just silenced a crowded restaurant without speaking a word, his hand hovering over the child's chest before resting there gently, as if confirming what I already knew, that the crisis had passed, and then his attention shifted back to me, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate, as though I had become a variable he needed to understand, and I felt it again, that strange sensation of being seen too clearly, not as a waitress in a worn uniform, but as something that had just altered the course of his night, maybe even more than that, and I pushed myself to my feet slowly, brushing my hands against my apron even though they were clean, needing something normal to hold on to as my heart tried to settle into a steady rhythm again. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than I expected, controlled, every word measured like it carried weight beyond the sound itself. You knew what to do. It was not a question, and I shook my head slightly, forcing my voice to stay steady as I answered. I just followed basic training, nothing special. Because I needed him to understand that I was not looking for anything from him, not gratitude, not attention, not whatever came with the kind of presence he carried into a room. But his gaze did not shift, did not soften. It only deepened in a way that made it clear he did not accept simple answers. And for a moment, I wondered how many people in his life spoke plainly to him without calculating the consequences first. The thought slipping through my mind before I could stop it, and then he stood, lifting the boy carefully into his arms as if the world outside this moment no longer existed, the movement smooth, practiced, protective in a way that contrasted sharply with the quiet intensity that surrounded him. And someone behind me finally spoke, asking if they should call an ambulance again, their voice hesitant like they were unsure who they were asking permission from. And the man did not look away from me as he responded, "No, he is fine," the certainty in his tone leaving no room for argument. And I realized then that he was used to being obeyed, not because he raised his voice, but because he never needed to, and the weight of that realization settled somewhere deep in my chest, uncomfortable and undeniable, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, as if confirming that my part in this was over, that whatever invisible line I had crossed by stepping forward tonight could still be uncrossed if I simply walked away now. But as he turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at me one last time, there was something in that look that made it clear he did not see it that way at all. Like the moment I chose to act had already written something neither of us could erase. And when the door closed behind him, and the cold air disappeared with it, the room slowly exhaled, conversations returning in low murmurs, chairs scraping, life resuming as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But I stood there for a second longer than I should have, staring at the empty space he left behind, with the quiet, unsettling understanding that whatever had just begun was not going to stay inside this restaurant. I told myself it was over the moment the door closed, that whatever strange gravity had pulled that man into my life would disappear as quickly as it had arrived. But the night did not return to normal the way it should have. Not really, because people kept glancing at me like I had done something extraordinary when all I had done was refuse to freeze. And even after the last table left and the chairs were flipped upside down onto polished surfaces, even after the lights dimmed and the hum of the refrigerator units became the loudest sound in the room, something lingered in the air that I could not explain, like the echo of a moment that had not finished unfolding yet, and I tried to shake it off as I clocked out, pulling my thin jacket tighter around me before stepping outside into the cool night air. The rain had softened into a light mist that clung to everything, the streetlights reflecting off wet pavement in long golden streaks that made the city feel quieter than it ever really was. And I started walking the 3 blocks to the bus stop with my hands tucked into my pockets, telling myself to think about rent, about groceries, about anything real and immediate instead of a man whose name I did not even know. But my thoughts kept circling back anyway, to the way the room had shifted when he entered, to the way he had looked at me like I was something more than background noise in his world, and I hated that it stayed with me, that it followed me all the way to the bus ride home where I sat by the window watching the city blur past in streaks of light and shadow, trying to convince myself that tomorrow would be the same as every other day, that I would wake up, put on the same uniform, and nothing would be different. But the next morning proved me wrong before I even had a chance to settle into that lie. Because when I pushed open the door to the restaurant for my afternoon shift, the first thing I noticed was the envelope sitting neatly on the counter, out of place among the usual clutter of receipts and menus, thick, cream-colored, expensive in a way that did not belong in a place like this, and my name was written across the front in clean, precise lettering, Lily Carter, as if whoever had sent it had taken the time to make sure there was no mistake about who It was 4, and my stomach tightened as I picked it up, the weight of it heavier than paper should feel, the edges crisp beneath my fingers, and for a moment I just stood there, staring at it like it might disappear if I waited long enough. But it did not, so I opened it carefully, sliding out a single card and a folded check that made my breath catch the second I saw the number written across it. More money than I had ever held in my hands at once. More than months of work condensed into a single piece of paper, and beneath it, a simple message written in the same precise script, for your help. No signature, no explanation, nothing that tied it directly to him, and yet everything about it made it obvious that it could not have come from anyone else. And I felt something twist in my chest, not relief, not gratitude, something sharper, something that felt too close to being claimed, like this was not a gift but a mark, a quiet way of saying that he had not forgotten, that he had not walked out of that restaurant and left the moment behind the way I had tried to, and I swallowed hard, folding the check back into the envelope as my mind raced through possibilities I did not like, because money like this did not come without strings, not from men like him. And as I stood there holding something that could change my life in ways I was not ready to accept, I realized with a sinking certainty that whatever line I thought I had avoided crossing last night had already been erased without my permission. I should have thrown it away the second I realized what it was, should have left the envelope on the counter and walked out like it did not belong to me, like none of this had anything to do with my life, but my fingers tightened around it instead, the weight of that check pressing into my palm like a decision I was not ready to make, and I could feel it already, the way it shifted something inside me, the way it made everything else suddenly feel smaller, my paycheck, my rent, the constant math I did in my head just to stay afloat. And that scared me more than anything, because money like this was not just help, it was leverage, and I did not know what it would cost me to accept it, so I tucked it into my bag without a word, ignoring the curious look from Maria as she asked who it was from, shrugging it off with a quiet, I do not know that even I did not believe, because saying his name out loud, even without knowing it, felt like giving the situation more reality than I was ready for, and I forced myself into routine, tying my apron, grabbing a notepad, moving through the motions of another shift like muscle memory could protect me from whatever this was becoming, but the day did not unfold the way it was supposed to, not even close, because by the time the lunch rush hit, there were already 2 men sitting at table 7 who did not fit, not in the way their suits were cut too precisely for this place, not in the way they barely touched the menus in front of them, not in the way their eyes tracked the room without appearing to move, and I felt it immediately. That same subtle shift in the air from the night before, quieter this time, but just as real, like a shadow that had followed me out of that moment and settled here, waiting, and I told myself I was imagining things, that not every man in a suit belonged to him, that the world did not revolve around one encounter no matter how intense it had felt, but when I approached their table and asked if they were ready to order, one of them looked at me with a calm, almost polite expression and said, "We are not here to eat, Miss Carter," and the sound of my name in his voice sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, because it confirmed what I had already started to suspect, that the envelope had not been the end of anything. It had been the beginning of something that now had direction, intention, and eyes, always watching, and I straightened slightly, forcing my voice to stay even as I asked, "Then what are you here for?" Even though I already knew the answer would not be something simple. And the man's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not friendly, not threatening, just certain, as he replied, "We were asked to make sure you are safe." And the words should have felt reassuring, but they did not. Not the way he said them. Not with that quiet confidence that suggested safety was not something I got to define anymore. And I felt something inside me push back against that, something stubborn and sharp that refused to be folded into someone else's control without a fight. So I met his gaze and said I did not ask for that, my voice low but steady, and for a second the room seemed to narrow around us again, the rest of the noise fading into the background as if this moment mattered more than anything else happening here, and the man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it, because that was not how this worked, not in his world, not in the one I had accidentally stepped into. And as I turned away from the table, my heart beating faster than I wanted it to, I realized with a clarity that made my stomach tighten that the line between my life and his had not just been crossed, it had been erased completely, And I was standing in a space where my choices no longer carried the same weight they used to, where even saying no did not mean what it should. I tried to focus on orders, on the rhythm of plates and glasses, and the familiar weight of a pen in my hand. But everything felt slightly off now, like the world had shifted half an inch and refused to settle back into place. Because no matter where I moved in the restaurant, I could feel them there. Not close enough to interfere, not obvious enough to draw attention, but present in a way that made my skin too aware of every glance, every step, every second that passed under their quiet observation, and it irritated me more than it scared me. That subtle assumption that I needed watching, that my life had somehow become a problem someone else needed to manage. So by the time my break came, I did not hesitate. I walked straight to table 7, stopping just far enough away to keep my voice low, but firm as I said, "You can tell him this is unnecessary." The words sharper than I intended, but impossible to take back. And the man looked up at me with the same calm expression as before. Like he had expected this moment all along. Like my resistance was simply part of the equation. And for a second neither of us spoke, the noise of the restaurant filling the space between us, before he leaned back slightly and said, "We do not make decisions, Miss Carter. We follow instructions." And something in the way he said it made it clear that the instructions did not come with room for interpretation. That this was not a conversation I could win by being louder or more insistent. But I was not ready to accept that either, not yet. So I crossed my arms slightly, grounding myself in the stubborn part of me that had carried me this far in life. And I said, "Then you can follow a new one. Leave." And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not offense, not anger, just the faintest flicker of something that might have been respect, or maybe curiosity. Like he was reassessing me in a way that had nothing to do with my job or my place in this room. And he nodded once, slow and deliberate, before reaching into his jacket and placing a small object on the table, sliding it toward me without breaking eye contact. A card, simple, clean, with a number printed on it in black ink that stood out against the white surface like it mattered more than anything else in the world. "If you wish to speak to him directly," he said quietly, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because they offered something I had not expected, a line, a choice, even if it was one that still led back to the same place. And I hesitated for half a second before picking it up, the paper smooth under my fingers, the number staring back at me like a door I was not sure I wanted to open, and without another word, I turned and walked away, tucking it into my apron as I forced myself back into motion, back into the routine I understood, but the rest of the shift passed in a blur. Every second stretched thin by the awareness of that card against my side, of the envelope still sitting in my bag, of the fact that my life now had edges I could not see clearly anymore. And when the night finally ended and I stepped outside into the cool air, the city quieter than it had been the night before, I found myself standing still for a moment longer than necessary, my hand resting against my pocket where the card waited, and I told myself I would not call, that I would go home, sleep, wake up, and pretend none of this existed, that I could still choose to walk away if I wanted to. But as I pulled the card out and looked at the number again under the dim streetlight, something inside me shifted in a way I could not explain, not fear, not curiosity, something deeper, something that felt like standing at the edge of a story that had already decided I was part of it, and before I could overthink it, before I could talk myself out of it, my fingers moved, dialing the number with a steadiness that did not match the way my heart was beating, each tone echoing in my ear like a countdown I could not stop, until the line clicked and a voice answered on the other end, low, controlled, unmistakable, and in that single moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever I said next would change everything. For a second I forgot how to breathe, the sound of his voice on the other end of the line pulling everything else into silence like the world had narrowed down to that single connection, and I stood there under the dim streetlight with the city moving quietly around me, cars passing, distant voices fading in and out, none of it reaching me the way it should have, because all I could hear was him, calm, controlled, waiting, as if he already knew it was me, as if he had been expecting this call, long before I decided to make it. And that realization settled deep in my chest in a way that felt both unsettling and strangely inevitable, and I swallowed, forcing myself to speak even though my voice came out quieter than I intended. "You should not have sent that money." The words simple, direct, but carrying more weight than I could fully explain. Because this was not just about the check or the men at the restaurant or the way my life had shifted overnight. It was about drawing a line. About reminding both of us that I still had one. Even if it felt like it was slipping through my fingers. And there was a pause on the other end. Not long. Just enough to make me aware that he was considering something. Measuring my words the same way he had measured me the night before. And when he spoke again, his tone did not change. Still steady, still precise. "You saved my son." And I exhaled slowly, shaking my head even though he could not see it. "I did what anyone would do," I said, knowing it was not entirely true because not everyone had stepped forward. Not everyone had acted, but I needed it to be true for this conversation to stay where I could control it. And there was something almost imperceptible in his response. Not disagreement, not acceptance, just a quiet acknowledgement that we were both choosing which version of the truth to stand on. And then he said it, not louder, not softer, just certain, not everyone. And the simplicity of it made something in my chest tighten, because he was right, and we both knew it. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like something that had its own meaning, something that did not need to be filled. And I realized then that this was how he operated, not through force or urgency, but through presence, through the quiet certainty that made people adjust themselves without being told to. And I forced myself to stay grounded, to remember why I called in the first place. "You do not need to watch me," I said. The words firmer now, clearer. "I am fine," and this time the pause was slightly longer, just enough to make me wonder if I had crossed something I should not have, if I had pushed too far into a space that did not belong to me. But when he answered, there was no anger, no irritation, just that same steady control that seemed to define everything about him. "You are not the one who decides that." And the sentence landed heavier than anything he had said before, not because it was loud, but because it was absolute, because it carried a weight that did not leave room for argument. And I felt my grip tighten around the phone as something inside me resisted, pushing back against the idea that my life could be managed like this, that my safety could be dictated by someone I had known for less than 24 hours. And yet beneath that resistance, there was something else, something quieter, something that recognized the certainty in his voice. The kind that did not come from arrogance, but from experience, from knowing how quickly things could change. And I hated that part of me, the part that almost understood, almost accepted, because it made everything more complicated than I wanted it to be. And I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the cool air ground me before I spoke again, softer this time, but no less determined. "I am not part of your world." And when he answered, there was no hesitation, no shift, just the same calm certainty that had followed me since the moment he walked into that restaurant. "You were the moment you chose to save him." And the words settled into me like something permanent, something that could not be undone no matter how much I wanted it to be. And I stood there in the quiet, the phone still pressed to my ear, realizing that whatever I had stepped into was not waiting for my permission to continue. I did not remember ending the call, not exactly. Only that the line went quiet, and somehow I was standing there alone again. The city still moving around me like nothing had changed while everything inside me felt different, heavier, like his words had settled into places I could not easily ignore. And I walked home slower than usual, my thoughts circling in a way that made sleep feel impossible long before I even reached my apartment. Because there was something about the certainty in his voice that stayed with me. Something that refused to be dismissed as arrogance or control, something that felt too grounded in reality to simply walk away from. And that was what unsettled me the most. Not him, not the money, not the men watching from a distance, but the possibility that he was right, that the moment I stepped forward had already tied me to something I did not fully understand. And I barely slept that night. The hours passing in fragments as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside and the ticking of the cheap clock on my nightstand, each second stretching longer than it should, until morning came too quickly and I forced myself out of bed, telling myself that routine would fix this, that work would ground me again, that everything would feel normal if I just kept moving. But the day proved me wrong in ways I could not ignore, because by the time I stepped out of my building, I felt it immediately, that same quiet awareness that had followed me in the restaurant, subtle but unmistakable, like the air itself was paying attention, and I told myself I was imagining it. that I was letting his words get into my head, that not everything had to mean something more. But halfway down the block I noticed the car, parked just far enough away to seem ordinary, just close enough to be intentional, and my steps slowed without me meaning them to, my eyes catching the reflection of movement in the window of a closed storefront. A figure inside the car shifting slightly, as if adjusting, not hiding, not approaching, just there. And a cold realization settled over me that had nothing to do with the morning air, because this was not protection in the way I understood it. This was presence, constant, controlled, deliberate, and I stopped walking for a moment, my heart beating faster than I wanted it to as I turned just enough to confirm what I already knew. The car did not move, did not react, but it did not need to, because its message was clear without a single action, and I exhaled slowly, pressing my lips together as frustration mixed with something deeper, something I did not want to name, because part of me understood this now. Understood that this was not about watching me every second. It was about being close enough to intervene if needed, close enough to ensure nothing unexpected happened. And I hated that understanding, hated that it made his actions feel less like control and more like something dangerously close to care, because that blurred a line I needed to keep sharp. And I forced myself to keep walking, my pace steady even as my mind raced, telling myself I would not adjust to this, would not accept it as normal, would not let my life become something managed from the outside. But as I reached the corner and glanced back one last time, the car was still there, still quiet, still present, and I realized with a clarity that settled deep in my chest that this was not temporary, not something that would fade if I ignored it long enough. This was the new shape of my life, whether I agreed to it or not. And the most unsettling part was not that he had changed everything in a single night. It was that a part of me was starting to understand why. By the time I reached the restaurant, I had already made up my mind that I would ignore it, ignore the car, ignore the feeling of being watched, ignore the quiet shift in my life that refused to return to normal. Because if I acknowledged it too much, it would become real in a way I could not control, and I was not ready to give that up, not yet. So I pushed through the door with the same routine, the same forced normalcy, tying my apron, grabbing my notepad, stepping into motion like everything was exactly the same as it had been before that night. But it was not, and the difference showed itself in ways I could not pretend away, because people noticed things before I did. The way Maria glanced toward the window more often than usual, the way the manager straightened his posture when certain customers walked in, the way the atmosphere carried a subtle tension that had nothing to do with the lunch rush, and I felt it building slowly, like something was approaching without making a sound, until it finally broke in the simplest way possible. The door opening, the bell above it chiming softly, and every part of me recognizing the shift before I even looked up. Because this was not like the others, not like the men who sat quietly in the corner or the car that stayed just far enough away to be unnoticed. This was direct, deliberate, impossible to ignore, and when I turned, he was there, standing just inside the entrance, as if the space itself had been waiting for him, his presence cutting through the room without effort, not loud, not dramatic, just absolute. And conversation slowed, then softened, then continued in lower tones as if everyone instinctively adjusted without understanding why, and I felt my pulse quicken in a way I could not control, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what his presence meant, because this was no longer distant, no longer something I could pretend was happening around me instead of to me. And he walked forward with that same measured pace, each step controlled, each movement precise, until he stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that the rest of the room faded into something indistinct, like background noise that no longer mattered. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just enough to make it clear that this moment belonged to him, that it always had. And then his eyes met mine, steady, unreadable, holding the same quiet intensity that had followed me since the night everything changed, and I felt it again, that strange pull between resistance and understanding, between wanting to step back and knowing that I would not. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, carrying just enough weight to make the words feel deliberate. "You called," and I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze even as my heart refused to slow. "Yes," I said, because I needed to, and something in his expression shifted slightly, not surprise, not satisfaction, just a subtle acknowledgement that confirmed what I was beginning to realize, that this was not a game to him, not a passing interest, but something intentional, something he had already decided mattered, and that realization settled into me with a clarity that left no room for denial. Because whatever line I thought I had been standing on, whatever distance I believed I could maintain, it was gone now, replaced by something closer, something real. And as I stood there facing him in the middle of my ordinary life that no longer felt ordinary at all, I understood that the moment I chose to dial that number, I had not just answered him. I had stepped fully into a world that was never going to let me remain untouched. For a moment, neither of us moved, the space between us holding something unspoken that felt heavier than any words either of us could choose. And I became acutely aware of everything at once, the quiet clink of glasses behind me, the low murmur of conversations that pretended not to notice, the faint hum of the lights overhead, all of it continuing as if this was just another ordinary interaction when it was anything but. And I forced myself to stay grounded, to remember who I was before this. Before him, before the night that changed everything. But it was harder now, standing this close, seeing the details I had missed before, the controlled stillness in the way he held himself, the precision in every movement, like nothing he did was accidental, like even standing here had purpose, and it unsettled me in a way I could not fully explain, because I was used to chaos, to unpredictability, to people who reacted without thinking. But he was the opposite of that, and that made him harder to read, harder to push against, harder to walk away from. And I realized with a quiet clarity that this was exactly why he had control over everything around him, because nothing about him was left to chance. And I took a small breath, steadying myself before speaking. I did not call to accept anything, I said, my voice low but firm, needing to establish something, anything that still belonged to me. And his gaze did not waver, did not challenge me, did not soften either. It simply held steady, as if he was listening not just to my words, but to everything beneath them. And when he responded, it was the same as before, calm, certain. Then why did you call? And the question landed in a way that made it impossible to answer without honesty, because anything less would feel like a lie he would see through immediately. And I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Because you do not get to decide what happens to my life. And there it was, the line I had been trying to draw since this began. Clear, simple, mine. And for the first time since he walked in, something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I saw it, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible pause that suggested I had said something that mattered. And instead of dismissing it, instead of overriding it the way I expected, he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. And then he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that the distance between us felt intentional, measured, like everything else about him. And his voice dropped slightly, still calm, but carrying something new beneath it, something that felt less like control and more like truth. You think this is about control? And I held his gaze, refusing to look away even as my pulse quickened, because what else would it be? And for a second the silence returned, stretching between us in a way that felt almost deliberate, like he was giving me time to consider the question before he answered it himself. And when he did, his words were simple, direct, impossible to ignore. It is about consequence, and something in my chest tightened at that, because it was not what I expected, not a demand, not a claim, but a statement that carried weight in a different way. And before I could respond, before I could push back again, he continued, his gaze steady, his voice unwavering. You stepped into something that does not disappear when you walk away, and I felt the truth of that settle into me whether I wanted it to or not, because I had already seen it, felt it, the way my life had shifted in quiet, undeniable ways, and I hated that part of it, hated that he was not entirely wrong, but I was not ready to surrender to it either, not completely. So I straightened slightly, holding on to the last piece of certainty I had left. That does not mean I belong to it, I said. And this time when he looked at me, there was something different in his eyes, something that had not been there before, not softer, not weaker, but more focused, more certain in a way that made my breath catch just slightly as he answered. You already changed it, and for the first time since this began, I did not have a response, not because I agreed, but because a part of me understood exactly what he meant, And as I stood there in the middle of a life that no longer felt entirely my own, I realized that this was not a moment I could walk away from. Not anymore. Because whether I accepted it or not, something had already begun, and it was not waiting for my permission to continue.